Welcome to the FT's Business Clinic Live. Today we're going to be discussing the furlough scheme. In a week's time, the 1st of August, the furlough scheme that's currently supporting the wages of around 9 million workers in the UK will begin to taper off. Companies will be able to claim less support from the government, and it will fall again in September and again in October, the last month that the scheme is open. So today we want to talk about how businesses of all sizes are coping as this lifeline of support is withdrawn. Now, I, Claer Barrett, personal finance editor of the Financial Times, am joined today by Craig Beaumont, who is the chief of policy at the Federation of Small Businesses. Craig will be helping me answer all of your questions on all things furlough. We've had quite a few come in already. You can give us one on ft.com by commenting at the end of the article, or if you're watching us on YouTube or LinkedIn, and if you put your comment or question in the live stream, the live chat, then it will reach me on my trusty iPad. But what we want to hear, particularly from small businesses today, about is how you are feeling about your staff coming back to work after furlough. Do you have jobs for them, or are you planning to make redundancies? What kind of economic pickup, if any, are you seeing in your business? And will the furlough bonus of £1,000 per worker and some of those other measures that were announced by the Chancellor at the summer statement make a material difference? We've also had quite a lot of messages already from limited company directors who are struggling to access support and have been excluded from the furlough scheme or from the self-employment grant. What more do you think the Chancellor should be doing to help? I'll be putting your views to Craig over the next 30 minutes. So do get those questions coming in. Now, Craig, thanks ever so much for joining us today. It's great to have you on the show.
Thanks, Claire. It's great to be here.
So let's start with some questions for you. Now, the Federation of Small Businesses did a great big piece of research, which was published yesterday, showing what a tough time small businesses in particular are having.
That's right. So we have a quarterly survey, and we had a huge turnout for this one. It's from the start of July. So most of the surveys you've seen in the press are from June or earlier, but this is July, so this is really up to date. And we saw that 23%, so a quarter nearly, of small businesses expect their performance to be much worse over the coming quarter, so quarter three, compared to the last one in quarter two. But there is a bit of polarization as well. So you've got this huge group of people who say that things are going to get worse before they get better. But for the first time, we're beginning to see a small group, about 13%, who expect their prospects to be much improved. Now, this is a confidence measure, so it's not strictly, economic data. This is how small businesses are feeling. So you've got a large group of people who say things are bad, a large group who say they're going to get worse, and then a small group just beginning to appear who are saying that things are improving. And these will be businesses who have managed to adapt. It'll be businesses who have secured support through the government support schemes, as opposed to those who've been deliberately excluded, which I know we're going to talk about. It's really interesting if you delve into locations, for example. So there's a bit of a bump in the northeast in particular, and the northwest. So in the north of England, then you see a bounce in construction, which of course is a sector that was allowed to stay operating, or with less disruption, I'd say, than others such as hospitality and retail. But interestingly, retail, which has been open, non-essential retail has been open for a little while, their footfall suggests that they're not doing quite as well as they'd hoped. So the initial bias, if you like, for thinking that things are going to get better then worsened. So it's a real mixed picture out there. But overall, it's very clear that profits are going to dip in quarter two and quarter three. And many businesses say they're also operating under capacity. So we are still, I'd say, at the start of the recovery. We're not even midway through that yet.
Well, thanks for summarising that research for us, Craig. Now, I'm going to turn to redundancies now. We've already had a comment from one of our watchers on YouTube, Mark Levotskis. He says, what's your prediction for the unemployment rate post-October? Well, have a think about that, Craig, while I ask you a bit more of this question. So we've seen some really big redundancies announced from big household names, Selfridges, 450 jobs to go there. They've announced this morning. Last week, we have John Lewis, Boots, Dyson, all hitting the headlines. But the problem with small businesses is that although they won't attract the same headlines if they're making staff redundant, there are a lot more small businesses. So if they're feeling the pain, they could potentially lay off higher numbers of people.
That's right. So, I mean, 23% in our survey said that they've reduced their headcounts over the last 3 months. So that's not furloughing your employees, that's letting people go, which of course is the last thing, the very last thing that a small business owner wants to do is to do that. So that will continue, I think, as the furlough scheme starts to wind down. Now, the 1st of August is the first date when a small employer will have to pay the cost on top of the 80% of the salary, the up to 2.5K. The government has also topped that up, paying the employer's national insurance costs and also the auto-enrollment pension equivalent. And it's those two bits that the employer will now start to pay. We estimate that's about 5% of the total cost. So it'll be the very, very start. And we'll be watching that very, very tightly. When we've looked at previous recessions in 2008, the vast majority of people who got a job after that recession, after the collapse and after the hike in unemployment, the vast majority got their job either in a small business because they're embedded in their local community. So as long as they can survive, they will start to recruit. It's either a job in there or setting up a small business themselves, becoming self-employed. And we've seen a trend since 2000 of quite a strong trend in favor of self-employment over a number of years now. And despite 1 year where there was a blip, I'd expect that to continue as people are made redundant and set up in business and then actually quite enjoy it and don't want to go back.
Well, you say that, but there are a lot of people at the moment, as we can see from all of the tweets that we've had last night and this morning, who are self-employed but are perhaps regretting that decision because of the problems that they've had accessing support under furlough. Now, many of the people who've contacted me are limited company directors, so they're not sole traders. They don't qualify for the self-employment income support scheme. And there's a huge variation, Craig, in the kind of help that different small businesses have received. Now, some company directors have furloughed the PAYE element of their salary. We've got one person called Lindsay Ravel. She runs her own business. She's a director. She says, being on furlough has caused me nothing but stress. I'm sure I've lost work to competitors who are getting the self-employment grant. And of course, under the rules of that scheme, you're still able to work and receive it. When you're a company director, if you furloughed yourself, other than doing your statutory duties, you can't work. All of this, she says, for £550 a month. Another person has texted us to say, Andy Stanley, he says he's living on savings and credit and falling into debt. Lucy Hatley, another small company director, she's had no support from the government. She is self-employed via self-assessment, but less than 50% of her earnings are through self-employment because she went fully self-employed too late. She says her business is operating at minus 80% turnover with £0 of profit since lockdown started. Why am I excluded? Another one has had no grant from the self-employment. This is Chloe. No grant from the council, no discretionary grant, which others have been eligible for. And although she has furloughed herself, the cost of this is the money that she's receiving is just £25 per week. Clearly not enough to make much of a difference.
I mean, these stories, we've had so many of these, so many of our members are affected. And what the government's never really understood is not just about the economic impact of what they're doing, but the human impact. So the government made some very deliberate decisions, and we have tried to change those or influence those or change where the line falls. And what I find really tough is those lines are often very, very harsh. So if you, for example, one of the cases, tweet that you just mentioned, is about someone who falls the wrong side of the £50,000 rule, someone else the wrong side of the 50% of earnings rule. And what's interesting is that £1 below the threshold, you get the maximum help. At £1 over the threshold, you get nothing whatsoever. So there's no real phasing, and you don't see many of these harsh lines in other schemes. So, with the staff furlough, for example, it's up to a cap of 2,500, and then that's where the cap stays. That was never put into the self-employment scheme, and there's a very, very strong argument that it should. So we've lobbied against these. We've got some very, I would say, we've had a couple of small victories, but they're very small in terms of the hundreds of thousands of people. But things like extra help for those with some where their pay was affected by their maternity leave, Again, that's only helped some of those people affected by that issue. Some help for those who are reservists who served in the armed forces. But none of these are the game changers that we need, which is to get some help to these 300,000, 400,000, even more company directors, and then the broader excluded community. Now, as we go forward, these company directors and others have had no help for 130 days. I mean, that's extraordinary. No income, no revenue, with all that damage to people's mental health and also damage to the economy as well, because these people aren't out there spending. So as the government looks to the autumn, we are trying to brainstorm some new ideas for this group, and we'll be going into the government to kind of encourage what does a rescue plan, what does a recovery plan look like for this group? And if the government is currently briefing out, for example, lots of tax rises that it wants to bring in, and they have hinted in the past at perhaps looking at the self-employment national insurance class 4 NICS increase. Well, the last thing I think this government should be looking at is putting tax on a group that they have deliberately and repeatedly excluded from support. You can't exclude them from support and then charge them off the back of it. So I think this is a very, very live debate. One issue I would like to raise is this £1,000 retention bonus from the furlough, which of course is
yes. Now let's talk a little bit about that. So if you have furloughed a staff member as a business and you bring them back and you keep them on your books and you're paying them a wage above a certain amount, I think it's until February. So you will then get at some point after that a furlough retention bonus of £1,000 per staff member. Now this can apply to any staff who have been furloughed. It doesn't matter whether they've been furloughed for 3 months or 3 weeks. You'll still get the £1,000. But the million-dollar question, if you like, is if limited company directors who have furloughed themselves, will they also be entitled to this £1,000, which, considering the small amounts of money many of them have received so far, the £1,000 could make a big difference.
Exactly, and there's real confusion over this now. So, we do some work on there are other outlets as well. So on the Martin Lewis show, for example, Martin Lewis, big figure, and he was told, he was assured that they would be covered. We have pressed hard on this to get confirmation out of HMRC and the government. That confirmation has not come. So I think we're waiting for the guidance. The guidance should be, in the autumn, but in the autumn feels like a long way to go for me. And these people have to keep going. These people have to survive. They have to be in the right place so that when the economic recovery comes strongly, these companies will be in the right place. So they will be able to help drive that recovery. And at the moment, these company directors are cut out of that.
Well, you mentioned, Craig, you're looking for new ideas for the autumn about what help could be provided for businesses who haven't been helped by the existing schemes. Now, we've got a great idea from Aina Santry via LinkedIn. Hello to everyone watching on LinkedIn. He or she says, government support for small businesses transitioning some of their business to online, for example, with website creation and IT support and delivery services would be a huge help. Well, certainly the bigger businesses, look at Amazon, yesterday's announcement, going into groceries in a big way. Definitely the bigger businesses are making an online push. How about helping the smaller businesses do the same?
Definitely. Actually, we are looking at something around digital vouchers. So as the government's looked at innovation normally as a kind of product, but actually we would like them to look at this more as firms that adapt and change more broadly, bringing new systems, new ways to work. You've got 85,000 new e-commerce sites that didn't exist before this crash. So that's small businesses setting up online for the first time. I think you can turbocharge that with a specific scheme, a specific help. So we are going to be pitching in for innovation digital vouchers that do exactly that. It's a great idea. And in great minds, what's the phrase? Great minds think alike, fools seldom differ. And I think on this one, we definitely agree with it.
Okay, well, we've had some amusing comments on YouTube asking, are the guitars in the background mine? Yes, they are my guitars. What's my favourite one? I don't have a favourite one, but they are all Fenders. I have a bass, an acoustic, and a Telecaster. And will I give you a tune? Asked somebody on YouTube. Well, perhaps if we get some help for limited company directors announced in the next few months, then I may come on and do a screeching guitar solo in celebration for you all. But now let's move on to another topical topic, Brexit. You would expect from FT readers who are watching this on ft.com to be concerned about Brexit. And Iantha, an FT subscriber, says, as a small business, what we need more than anything is a Brexit deal. We need to know if our staff will be able to work in the EU for more than 90 out of 180 days. The government seems to refuse to acknowledge that 80% of British exports are services, i.e. people. What's your view on this one, Craig?
So she's absolutely right. We need a deal. What we don't want to do is go back to the row over whether Brexit is good or bad. In fact, everything should now be talking about, rather than Brexit, talking about the deal, talking about the UK transition. What are we actually heading towards? We're now in July. We've only got 5 months to go before the end of the transition period, and we don't yet know exactly what will happen on the 1st of January. Now, of course, we've been here before, and we know that things are agreed at the last minute. But the vast majority of those UK small companies who export either services or products do so to the EU. So that becomes, that is absolutely a paramount importance. But it's not the only deal that matters. And small businesses, you ask them which is the biggest individual country that they're interested in exporting to, it's the US. So that US trade deal is really rising in importance too. We need to work out what that free trade agreement looks like. And within that US trade agreement, we have embedded in there something called a small business chapter. So that is a dedicated part of the agreement to help small businesses work out, US small businesses and UK, how do they export to the other country? So that includes things like it sets up procedures, committees, and that's now embedded in the US trade deal. That is also going to be embedded in the Japan trade deal, the Australia trade deal, the New Zealand trade deal, the Australia and New Zealand trade deal. And finally, the CPTPP, which is the big one covering 13% of kind of Asian and Pacific economies. So we're making some progress on the small business front. But of course, none of these agreements are agreed. Remember that phrase with the EU, nothing's agreed till everything's agreed. So while we know it's embedded in the agreements, it hasn't yet been put into concrete. So over the next 4 months, we would like to see progress in the US trade deal, Japan, and Europe. And if we get all three of those, then I think small exporters have actually got something really interesting to look at for the future.
And within your survey, the really confident ones, were any of those in the export trade out of interest?
There was a few. The percentage who said that their export intentions were lower than last year was very high, but it's improved slightly since the previous quarter. So I think people have gone from the doldrums of April and May and starting to think about, okay, so some air routes are now being unlocked. So there is some progress. But of course, the news on Spain and the quarantine affects not just imports and exports within that plane as well as passengers, but it also affects business travel and it affects tourism. So while you might think all quarantine, it's not potentially not perhaps a core business issue, it really is. It's a human issue as well for those people who, of course, are in Spain now. But when they come back, how do employers deal with people who come back if they have to work in the workplace and they're faced with a 14-day quarantine? You've got to respect the quarantine. But what support is there? And there isn't anything at the moment for that. So if you like, it's one of those issues where you start with exports and it kind of grows and grows and grows into other areas. But if we're going to recover from this coronavirus, then I think it's probably an export-led recovery, because there are going to be other economies around the world who get going quicker than us. We were later into this than others. So while you may see China begin to come back very, very strongly, if so, we need to trade with them, and a lot.
Okay, well, I'm going to go back to the question now of small business owners who are looking into the months ahead as the furlough support is wound down and trying to make that very, very difficult and painful decision. Should they pay to keep staff on their books, or should they cut their losses and make redundancies? Now, there's a mixed reviews from readers on the FT. Democracy One says, why support failing businesses? Seriously, after 4 months of support, if the business can't adapt, why should taxpayers support it? Well, it's a strong view. I have to say, it's not the view of the majority. There are lots of people who are tweeting to say that they feel they're at a crossroads. They haven't got much more money to carry on. They've had to borrow money. They've obviously got money from bounce back loans, which has been a godsend. They don't have to start repaying those for nearly another year. But clearly, Craig, there are going to be big crunch points coming, especially for small businesses.
There are. So as we look to the autumn budget, one area really focusing on the moment is recapitalisation, which is thinking about all this debt. So there was already quite a lot of debt as we came in, existing debt as we came into this crisis. But through Sybil's loans, there's 50,000 of those, bounce back loans, over 1 million of those. If you start totting up all the debt, City UK work with us on a project, and they estimate that unsustainable debt levels to be about 1.2 trillion pounds, 1,200 billion. Now, how you then manage that is going to have an economic impact. So if that money all becomes due at certain points, certain pinch points, like you mentioned, so a lot of people have got mortgage holidays or credit holidays. Those look as though they're scheduled to end in October. So that'll be a moment when money comes out from small business, out from the economy to paying debt. The first Sybil's loans will start in the spring. The first bounce back loans, because they're a little bit later, will start paying back in June next year. So you can almost see these dates when there's going to be a sudden crunch. And the last thing we need with a nascent recovery is to kill it off, because small businesses start to look after themselves by cutting back on expenditure, cutting back on people in order to pay a repayment. So we're asking for almost like a student loan style approach. So I had a student loan, and I knew it was a large number, but at the same time it wasn't scary, because I knew I would only pay it back when I could afford it. When I could afford it. And I think that's where a small business would do well. If they know that they won't have to start paying their repayments until they are making a profit, then that will protect swathes of the economy, and it will also help protect company directors, many of whom have taken on a lot of debt in here as well. So that's a real live project at the moment between ourselves, City UK, and the Treasury.
Well, and on that note, Claer, who tweets as dead weight, she is a supplier of interior fixtures and fittings to the hospitality business. She says, we've had no support. Universal credit isn't enough to pay for our food bill. We are £12,000 in personal debt, and business is still non-existent. We've just put our house on the market as we're so desperate and are now borrowing money. Well, Claer, I'm really sorry to hear that things are so bad for you. And I know it's no consolation that you're not alone, but there are very many similar messages that we're getting from people who are at the end of their tether. Now, another big crunch point coming up, if you're a business that rents their premises or a shop or an office, is of course the rent. Now, on LinkedIn, Joseph Konofsky, who's a data manager, asks what leeway remains for those SMEs where aspects such as rent and business rates could be the straws that break them. Now, many businesses have been able to either not pay their rent or negotiate a discount. That obviously is something that they have to go on and keep negotiating with landlords. But business rates, the holiday that they have been granted, whilst welcome, is definitely a temporary move at the moment.
Well, I mean, that supplier who supplies hospitality is a perfect example of where these harsh lines can be a problem. So the £10,000 cash grants that have gone to more than 850,000 small businesses, that's fine. Of those, they haven't gone to enough people, but they've gone to, that's more than 800,000 small businesses helped. So let's credit that. But the extra help that went to retail and hospitality businesses, because of the way the business rate system works, not only was it limited, obviously, to those who are premises, which cuts out lots of people, but it also was about the purpose of the business. So if you're a hospitality business by its purpose, by the business rate system, you got extra help. You got the business rates holiday, you got a higher grant. Now, if you're a supplier to that sector, you did not get any of that, which meant that I've had a frozen food supplier for restaurants similarly, and they are part of the hospitality sector, but they don't count as hospitality business. So they were cut out. So whenever you have these lines that are harsh, it really does remove people. And that's where we would like to see more power given to local authorities and more funding as well, both on hardship funds that could be based on need rather than sector or business, but also these discretionary funds, which some people have accessed, some people haven't, depending on what the local authorities' kind of drive is. We've had some that have really helped